Now, I think one of the ways in which I wanted to start off tonight was to point out that we live in interesting times. And I think there's a good way to point this out. It was only a couple months ago when there were a lot of people in the presidential fields of both parties that one of the major parties, I won't say which one, had a debate. And here are the candidates. You figured it out. And here are the candidates. And at one point in the debate, the moderator decided to have a little fun. He asked the following question. Is there anybody on the stage who doesn't believe in evolution? And it turns out, as you may remember, that 3 hands went up from these individuals. You'll see the 3 hands in just a second. Sam Brownback, Mike Huckabee, and Tom Tancredo. And later on, by the way, Ron Paul said he'd been confused, and his hand would have gone up too, if he'd understood the question. So he explained. So it actually were 4 people on the stage. Now, each of these individuals subsequently explained why they said this. But to me, the most interesting explanation came from Governor Mike Huckabee. Now, early on in the presidential campaign, when it was more of a spectator sport, I have to tell you that Huckabee was my favorite presidential candidate. And what I mean by that is far and away most entertaining. Funniest, and I mean that in a good way, wittiest. The guy plays a wicked guitar. He's got a great sense of humor. I enjoyed his candor. I really enjoyed listening to him. And what he did when he explained himself is set right here. And as I read that, something about that explanation as to why he rejected evolution just sort of burned itself into my memory. And what it was he says, you know, if anybody else wants to believe that they are the descendants of a primate, they are welcome to do it. But Governor Huckabee, of course, didn't believe that at all. And I thought about that for a long time. And I actually hoped during the primary campaign in my state or in New Hampshire next door that I might actually get a chance to meet Governor Huckabee. It's easy to do early on in the primaries. And if I had, I would have gone up to him. I didn't do it. But if I had, I would have said, you know, I really enjoy you in the race. I like your candor. Please keep that great sense of humor. Your speeches are terrific. But Governor, just between you and me, I got to tell you something. Governor, you are a primate. And so were your mom and dad. And therefore, you are, in fact, descended from a primate. And evolution's got nothing to do with it. And I could imagine at that point, he would have said, oh yeah, who says? I mean, who says that we are primates? So, you know, maybe it's that gosh-awful, evil Charles Darwin who did this. And some people might actually think that. But it turns out Darwin is not to blame for classifying us as primates. The person who classified us as primates was Linnaeus, the father of modern scientific classification, who was a creationist. And Linnaeus was such a creationist that in the frontispiece of his book, he wrote, Deus creavit Linnaeus disposuit. And that means God creates, but Linnaeus arranges. That's what he saw for his job in nature. And here's a nice picture of Linnaeus here. Now, just in case you doubt me on this, I went to the rare book collection at my school's library, and we got a copy of an original Linnaeus, and I scanned it so you can see it. Here it is right here. And here is his classification of primates, primates, and you can see the very first genus he mentions is Homo. That's us. So there is documentation that, in fact, it's Linnaeus, a creationist, who says we are primates. It has nothing to do with evolution. It is simply a biological fact. Now, the interesting thing about the whole evolution business is that evolution really has been a nationwide controversy in this country for years. Time magazine, about 2 years ago, did a really informative cover story on this called The Evolution Wars. And in there they pointed out how many Americans reject the theory of evolution. In many surveys, most of them. They pointed out that our president has spoken out on this issue, not always helpfully, from the point of view of many of us in science and in education. Although, look closely at that. Joe Levine, my co-author, and I, we got such a kick out of seeing which biology textbook they had superimposed President Bush's face on. And that is in fact our book. And you know we're always looking for new cover art. And I was thinking, the next time your state has a statewide adoption, that might be a winner. So you may see that at some point in the future. But just to illustrate the scale of what I'm talking about, I have actually testified in federal trials on evolution in the last couple years in 2 states, in Georgia and Pennsylvania. In 2006, state elections turned on the issue of evolution in 2 other states, and those states were Ohio and Kansas. And it was the State Board of Education elections where evolution was the issue, pardon me, in both of these states. Now you might wonder, what does a state election look like where the campaign revolves around the issue of evolution? So I figured I'd show you. This is a headline from the largest newspaper in Ohio, the Plain Dealer, about 10 days before the elections in '06. And you can see it says, normally low-profile contest in Spotlight. This was the contest for state board. And because it's a Cleveland paper, they talked about the contest for the seat there. And it was between the incumbent, the leader of the anti-evolution forces on the board, a marketing professor from the University of Akron named Deborah Owens-Fink, and her opponent, a fellow with the very memorable name of Tom Sawyer. And Sawyer was unabashedly pro-evolution and pro-science. Now, what did the discourse in this race look like? Here's what a radio talk show host told his audience in Cleveland that this election boiled down to. What he said was, if you believe in God, creation, and true science, vote for Debbie. If you believe in evolution, abortion, and sin, vote for her opponent. Now you've probably seen a lot of analyses of the last election, breaking down the vote by gender, by class, by race. I've never seen one that broke down the sin vote. So you might like to see how that turned out in Ohio. And it turns out that pro-evolution candidates swept the slate in Ohio and took control of the Ohio Board of Education. Something very similar happened in the state of Kansas. And what I tell my colleagues in the scientific community is never to despair of democracy. If we take the case up for science to the American people, they will make the choice, and they'll make the right choice. But we actually have to do the hard work of getting out of the laboratory and getting out of the field station of the classroom and making clear what science is all about. Now, the interesting thing in all of this, as many of you know, is that evolution has been opposed in recent years by a concept called intelligent design. And the advocates of intelligent design say that the scientific community is closed-minded and will not deal with this new idea. So they have to have special help. And let me show you what I mean by this. They claim basically that intelligent design is this brand new idea. They overlook the fact that scientific communities deal with novel scientific claims all the time. So what do you do when you have that new idea? The answer is you do research to back it up. You submit that research to peer review. Now, peer review doesn't mean you send one article to one journal and then you whine and whimper if it gets rejected. All of us in science have papers rejected all the time. It means you show up at the scientific community. You participate in give and take. You argue. You go back and forth. And eventually, if your idea has merit, if it has evidence on its side, you know what's going to happen? You're going to win some sort of a consensus in the scientific community. Either that you're right, or even if people think you're not right, at least that it's a productive and useful idea. And then quite automatically, what's going to happen is that idea is going to wind up in classroom and textbook. Now, the advocates of intelligent design say, you know, we've got a new scientific idea too. And if they wanted to do exactly what I've shown here, to go through this process, I wouldn't have any objection at all. See at the cell biology meetings. See at the biochemistry meetings. Let's see your data. Let's argue about it. But their idea of how science should work is not like this. Their idea is a little bit more like this. A direct injection into classroom and textbook. And they actually seem to think that the scientific process is something that's best avoided. And to me, simply as a scientist, this is a dangerous precedent because it essentially argues that when you have a novel scientific idea, you don't do any of that messy stuff. You simply appeal to the state legislature, the State Board of Education, and you use political leverage to get your idea in the classroom. Even if your idea is right, that's the wrong way to do science. And that's one of my great concerns about this opposition to evolution. Now, the interesting thing is even the advocates of this idea of intelligent design admit it's a scientific failure. And here's what I want to show. This is Johnson. And I like, he's a retired professor of criminal law at the University of California. And I always like to tell people that intelligent design, like a lot of bad ideas, came out of the Berkeley campus. And that infected the rest of the country. And Johnson, who is a professor at Berkeley, admitted just about a year ago, he said, you know, I don't think there is. And Philip Johnson, I should add, is the intellectual godfather. No one would argue with this of the intelligent design movement.